Right, welcome back to ABC, and we are continuing our series on the doctrine of Christ. Today is the 25th of September, so we are starting a new locus in the doctrine of Christ, or sub locus in the doctrine of Christ, and that is the work of Christ. So the doctrine of Christ are concerned primarily of two aspects: the person of Christ that we've dealt with, and now the work of Christ. So the person of Christ is on the incarnation, what happened at the incarnation, and the work of Christ is what happened on the cross. Right. So the two major things about Christ is the incarnation and the crucifixion. The crucifixion will include the resurrection, the ascension, and all of that. So the incarnation event and the Easter event. Right. So the work of Christ, Christ the victor. Next week we'll do satisfaction theory, penal substitution, so on and so forth. So what is the work of Christ? The work of Christ is also known as the atonement. The atonement. Basically, the question is, how did the death of Christ reconcile God and humanity? Because the Bible keeps saying, New Testament keeps saying that we are reconciled to God, right? While we were enemies, now they have been reconciled to God, and that is through the death of Christ. That is a fact, but the question is, how did the death of Christ reconcile God and humanity? Because if you think about it, it's basic Christ, okay, he died on the cross. So how did a man dying on the cross save us? How did a man dying on the cross reconcile God and us? So that's a mystery, isn't it? So let's delve right into it. The first thing is, what is atonement? The English word atonement comes from the Middle English at-one-ment, meaning to the reconciliation of two parties at one ment. So previously there were at two-ment or at odds-ment, I don't know, and the bringing of two warring parties together is at one-ment, and therefore the modern English word atonement. Now, of course, the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek, so the concept must come from the biblical Hebrew and the biblical Greek. The biblical Hebrew word that we are looking at is kippur. 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 Trust me, this is pronounced as kippur. And kippur most prominently appear in the book of Leviticus to make atonement. The sacrifices make atonement for the offerer, and also for the furnitures of the tabernacle, right? So, and the seat of mercy. So in the Holy of Holies, there is an Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant is a box cover, right? A box cover. Now that cover is kaparot. Kaparot is come from the word kippur. So that mercy seat itself is atonement, right? Is kippur. The reason is that the high priest would once a year enter into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the blood of bull and blood of goat to atone for his own personal sins and also the sins of Israel. So that it's kind of like a annual reset, if you will. Now, literally, kippur means to cover, or to purify, or to cleanse. So, atonement, biblically, it means purification. It means the covering of sin. The Greek word that translates it is hilasterion, And hilasterion means the same thing. Some kind of a covering or purification or cleansing. So you can see that there is actually a kind of a difference between the biblical words atonement and the English word atonement. The English word atonement is about reconciliation, whereas the biblical words that we translate into atonement actually means purification or cleansing. Although the terms are related, they are not exactly the same. And that is why there is confusion when we read the Bible about atonement and about atoning sacrifice. Immediately we think about the reconciliation of two parties, because that's what the English word actually means. But that is not necessarily what the biblical word means. So now we have the difference between the theological atonement and the biblical atonement, because the biblical word atonement means to cover, to purify, but the theological concept of atonement is about reconciliation, and this is what we want to focus on, the theological concept of atonement, and not necessarily the biblical word for atonement. Okay, so the theological concept for atonement is the reconciliation of God and humanity. And this reconciliation has two aspects. One is propitiation and the other is expiation. Propitiation is to avert the wrath of God caused by human sin. So an expiation is to remove guilt or to be cleansed from sin. And you can remember these two words by the pro, right? Pro is for something. It's pro pistiate, to basically it is for God, to satisfy God, if you will, to avert the wrath of God that is upon human sin, to bring about a change of attitude of God toward us, from an unfavorable one to a favorable one. So you can think of it as to change God's attitude from one that is unfavorable toward us to being favorable toward us. Propitiation. Expiation is ex, right? To remove, to excise, right? To expel guilt and cleanse us from sin. So I gave this example in the sermon last week about suppose you were to spill coffee on my shirt. Now immediately I may react, right? So there is a breaking of fellowship, if you will, between us, right? There is an injury to our relationship because you spilled coffee on my shirt in that particular moment. And you say, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, right? So by saying sorry, and I say, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine, I forgive you. So to forgive you, that averts the wrath, isn't it? So I was maybe upset with you, but then you say sorry, and say, okay, that's fine, right? And I'm no longer upset with you. But the thing is that the coffee stain is still there on my shirt. And so you need to cleanse, right, my shirt from the stain from coffee stain. So likewise, there is a need to expiate sin. God forgiving us by propitiating, when the sin is propitiated, God can forgive us, but there's a need to also cleanse us from sin to have full restoration of the fellowship, right? So these two related concepts of propitiation and expiation is what makes up the atonement, the reconciliation of God and humanity. So there are various ways to understand how human beings and God are reconciled, how propitiation and expiation is achieved. So the first theory that I want to be looking at is the theory of Christ the victor. Christus victor is the Latin, Christ the victor. Now, Christ the victor, this theory says that on the cross, Christ scored the decisive victory over Satan and his world system by liberating humanity from sin and death. So it is a Exodus story, right? So in the Exodus, Pharaoh is this symbol for Satan, if you will, right? And Egypt is his empire, the world system of Satan, which enslaves God's people in slavery, right? To build Satan's empire or Pharaoh's empire. Likewise, we were under the dominion of Satan and his world system, and we are subjugated by Satan because of our sin, in sin and in death. So what happens on the cross is that Christ scored the decisive victory over Satan and his world system by liberating humanity from sin and death. And just like Moses, God through Moses, liberated the Israelites from Egypt through the splitting of the Red Sea and defeating Pharaoh's army buried in the Red Sea. So that is the parallel, right, of because after all, the Exodus is the salvation story of Israel. If you ask the Israelites, what is your salvation story? They will say, my salvation story was that we were once slaves in Egypt, and with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, God liberated us from the dominion of Satan, from the dominion of Pharaoh, Egypt, and slavery, right? So likewise, the Christian have the similar story of salvation. That is, we were once under the dominion of Satan, sin, and death, and his world system, and now Christ, through his death on the cross, has liberated us from that, and now we are freely available to worship God. So that is Christus Victor in a nutshell. Now, this theory goes way back. Way back. The root of this theory begins with the church fathers. The church fathers, they came up with the idea of ransom theory. Now, ransom theory, the church fathers, of course, lived during the time where you have to buy back prisoners of war, buy back slaves, right? Buy back slaves, buy back prisoners of war to secure the liberty of prisoners of war or slaves. So that is the idea. That the word for it is redemption. So the ransom theory that the church fathers say is that, well, Satan held humanity captive to sin and death. And we have Bible verses for that. 2 Timothy 2:25-26. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. So there were people were in a trap, entrapped by Satan, and Satan has taken them captive to achieve satanic will. 1 John 5:19, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. So the opening line of ransom theory is that Satan held humanity captive to sin and death. That is the opening premise. Well, what then was Christ's death? Christ's death was a ransom payment made to deliver humanity from Satan's bondage. So in order to free humanity, just like how you buy back slaves, just like how you buy back prisoners of war, it is through a payment of ransom. This is what redemption means. Redemption is a marketplace terminology that is used to buy the freedom of a slave. 30 pieces of silver is the price for the liberation of a slave, which is also the price that was paid for to betray Jesus, to crucifixion. So there's a lot of links between Jesus' death, the passion of Christ, with redemption. The redemption features are built into the story of Jesus' death, including the 30 pieces of silver. So we have Mark chapter 10 verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So this is Mark 10:45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So his death pays the ransom for us. So Satan's calculation is that, this is a good deal. What God was asking for was the release of these human captives, and I get to, in exchange, hold down the Son of God. And I now look at the Son of God, has incarnated as a human being. I observe this Jesus. He seems weak. He seems, he needs to sleep. He needs to eat. He bleeds. He's mortal. And this is my opportunity to score a victory over divinity. So it's a good exchange for Satan. Right? Satan say, I release all these human beings from captivity, and I get the Son of God, a weakened Son of God in return. So Satan made the exchange. But the payment was a ruse. Once the captives are freed, the Son of God rose from the dead. He's not weakened at all by the incarnation. Rather, he still was the Son of God, and Satan couldn't hold down the ransom. Well, it's not God's fault that you couldn't hold down the ransom. You couldn't hold down the ransom, that's on you. But the ransom was indeed made, the exchange was made, and therefore the people are freed. Therefore, this is a major victory over the enemy by having this ransom payment that Satan couldn't hold down. He was tricked by God into accepting the ransom payment. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, paints a very vivid picture. In order to secure that the ransom on our behalf may be easily accepted by him, that is Satan, who required it. So basically, God wants to free humanity from under the dominion of Satan, and ask Satan, what's the price? And God said, how about Jesus? Why don't you take Jesus instead? And Satan thought, yes, but he's the Son of God. How can I hold him down? And so therefore there was the incarnation. The deity was hidden under the veil of our nature. So the incarnation was the hiding of the divinity of Christ under the veil of our nature, so that Satan thought that, Jesus is just another mortal person. I can hold him down. So that as with ravenous fish, the hook of deity might be gulped along with the bait of the flesh. So God here being a fisherman, baited Satan, the fish, with the worm, okay, that is the flesh of Christ, the humanity of Christ. But as he gulped down the humanity of Christ, he also gulped down the hook that is the divinity of Christ, and that's how he got tricked. So that is the ransom theory of the church fathers, where Christ's death was a victory over the enemy. Now immediately some objections would surface, isn't it? Number one, Satan does not have rights over human beings. God does not owe Satan anything except eternal damnation, much less owing him the price of his own son. No, God could just snap his finger and execute divine justice on Satan. And Satan deserved punishment, and God would not be unjust to immediately send him to hell and liberate the people with a snap of the finger. What is the point of making the ransom payment in order to free humanity? In fact, the incarnation was unnecessary. Neither was it necessary for Jesus to go to the cross. God, like I said, could just snap his finger and the matter is done. He could just simply forgive people of their sins and punish Satan accordingly. Why then did Jesus pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking the Father whether there's any other way they could go about doing this, and coming to the conclusion that there is no other way but to go to the cross? Jesus obeyed the commands of the Father even unto death. So all of those would have been unnecessary. Now the church fathers would tell you, yes, indeed it was unnecessary. There was no need for the crucifixion, and in fact there was no need for the incarnation. God could have done it some other ways, but God in his divine sovereignty have decided to do it this way. So it is God's choice to do it this way. There were other ways to liberate humanity. This was the option that God chose to do. So the incarnation and the crucifixion were all not because it is necessary to do so to free human beings, but that was what God chose to do. So these are some of the objections that are leveled at the ransom theory, that it renders incarnation and crucifixion unnecessary, and that God doesn't really have to do this. In fact, Satan does not have rights over human beings. Human beings are made in the image of God. We belong to God, and this is not his world. This is my Father's world. Things like that. Now, despite these objections, if you read the biblical passages, Christ's death was indeed a victory over the enemy. Suppose we say, okay, what is important here is not the mechanism. Ransom theory is a mechanism as to how God liberated humanity. What we want to focus on in Christus Victor is the fact that Christ, the work of Christ, is first and foremost a victory over the powers of which hold mankind in bondage: sin, death, and the devil. This is Aulen, Gustav Aulen, who popularized the doctrine of Christus Victor, or the theory of Christus Victor. Colossians 2:15, he disarmed the rulers and authorities. The rulers and authorities here refers to Satan and his angelic powers, and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So he defanged Satan and his minions and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So that is so God disarmed the rulers and authorities. God put them to open shame. God triumphed over the enemy in Jesus Christ. Colossians 2:15. Hebrews 2:14-15, which is quite close to what Gregory of Nyssa was saying. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, that is Christ, likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. So basically, what is the atonement? The atonement is the victory of Christ over the enemy by becoming a human being and died on the cross, so that through his human death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, and thereby delivering or liberating all of us who are subject to lifelong slavery to sin because of the fear of death. Think about it. Why do we lie? We lie because we're scared of losing something. If we tell the truth, it will be to our harm, or perceived that it will be to our harm. And that is why we lie. We think that by lying, it is to our advantage, and we will avoid some of the cost that is associated with telling the truth. So we do not want to. Why do we steal? Because again, if we don't, maybe it will be a cost to us. Why do we do this? Why do we commit sins? Well, it is for some perceived benefits and the avoidance of certain loss. And the ultimate loss, the capital loss, would be the loss of the capital, that is the loss of the head, the fear of death. So because the devil is like the grim reaper, having the power of death, and we who fear death are therefore willing subjects to lifelong slavery to Satan and sin, in order to stave off death by committing all kinds of sin. So that is no longer necessary for us who believe in Christ. We no longer have to commit sin because we no longer have the fear of death, because Christ has conquered the one who has the power of death, right? So that is the idea of how our reconciliation with God comes about. 1 John 3:9, whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. So here, clear as the sky, why the reason the Son of God came in the flesh was to destroy the works of the devil. It is a victory over the enemy. So, according to the theory of Christus Victor, Christ's death was the decisive moment in the war against Satan. So the decisive moment, the climax of the biblical story. So the Bible is a narrative, and like every good story, there is the opening situation, and then there is the rising action, and then there is the conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist, and the conflict reaches a climax, and then there's a falling action after the climax, and then we reach a new normal. Now, we think that the climax is in the book of Revelation. No, the climax is not the second coming of Christ. The climax was the cross. The cross was a climax, the decisive moment in the war against Satan. What is going on right now and until the end is the rear guard action, that the desperate attempt to prolong defeat. So D-Day was already there, all right, and Hitler continues to fight for another year, for another half a year, but and he fought fiercely, and the Allies took losses, but the war was basically over after the landing at Normandy, isn't it? Because once the Allies were able to establish the beachhead at Normandy on D-Day, that basically spells the end of the war, and all we need to do is just this mop-up operation of Hitler's Europe. So similarly, Christ's death on the cross was the decisive moment in the war against Satan that would ultimately consummate in his being cast into the lake of fire and the coming of the new heavens and new earth. That was Christ's death. What about his resurrection? His resurrection demonstrates that the power of Satan was overthrown. So what was the power of Satan? The power of Satan was death. Right? Satan had the power of death. And how do we know that Satan has been defeated? When Christ rose from the dead. To see, Christ rose from the dead, that means death couldn't hold down the resurrection life. So where, O death, is now your sting? Where, O grave, is your victory? Isn't it? Death has lost its sting. The sting of death is sin. And since death, normal, is rather typical, everyone dies. But if sin is a problem, then there is going to be judgment after death. So the sting of death is sin. But if sin has been dealt with, then the physical death is just physical death. There will be resurrection after that. So therefore, death no longer scares the Christian because of the resurrection of Christ. So that is Gustav Aulen's Christus Victor. Are there some objections to Christus Victor? Well, there are a few. The theory by itself does not specify how human beings are reconciled to God. It just says that Christ defeated the enemy on the cross. Well, good for you, Jesus. You rose from the dead. That's great. But how does that reconcile me to God? And how does that reconcile God to me? What is the mechanism? Now, maybe the mechanism could have been a ransom payment, right? A ransom payment would fit the bill as being a mechanism. You can specify exactly how that happened. It was a ransom payment to liberate humanity, and Satan took the bait and said, okay, agreed to the exchange, and the exchange was made. He freed the human captives, and took Jesus into the realms of the dead. But Jesus rose from the dead because he is the author of life. Okay, so that's a mechanism we can understand, or that's exactly how Christ scored a victory over the enemy. But if you remove ransom payment because of the problems associated with it, God doesn't owe Satan a ransom payment. God only owes him punishment, and that would render the incarnation and the whole thing unnecessary. God could have just snapped his finger and all this thing done. So Christus Victor doesn't say that, doesn't tell us how it's done, and having rejected ransom payment, Christus Victor is without a mechanism. Secondly, Satan may be defeated, but has the sins of humanity been overcome? I mean, do we not have agency? Do we not have the freedom of the will? Yes, there was a serpent in the garden. Yes, he initiated it. But the humans were, now that we're fallen, more than willing to continue to sin, even after the defeat of Satan on the cross. We bear responsibility. Can we just say that every sin we commit is because of Satan, and there's nothing in our own being that wants to commit the sin? It is always, we always sin due to the manipulation of Satan, and not necessarily that our heart itself is very deceitful. Are human sinners not a barrier to reconciliation? You may defeat Satan, but have you defeated us? Isn't it? So that is the question. So Satan may be defeated, but human beings may still not want to be reconciled, or that our sins may still not yet be expiated. Nor is the wrath of God necessarily propitiated. So therefore, the theory is definitely there. It's definitely part of a full doctrine of the atonement, but by itself, it is insufficient. So that would be my analysis of Christus Victor. That Christus Victor, Christ scoring a victory over the enemy, is definitely an important and integral part of a well-orbed doctrine of atonement, but it is not entirely on its own, because on its own it doesn't tell us how reconciliation is achieved. In order to do that, we would have to go through other theories, and next week we'll be talking about the satisfaction theory proposed by St. Anselm of Canterbury, and see if the satisfaction theory could provide a mechanism to achieve reconciliation that is lacking in the Christus Victor model. And that is for next week. As for this week, we have covered Christ the victor on the cross. Christ scored the decisive victory over Satan and his woe system by liberating humanity from sin and death.